So again, our training today is brought to you by our partners over at Monterey County Works. And today we are so pleased to have Laura Kirshner, the business services specialist there, who's here to share more about resources available to employers like you. Good morning, Laura.
Good morning, Anna. Thank you so much for having me, and we are so glad to partner with CEA. It's always such a pleasure. These are great webinars for those of you who haven't been here before. We encourage you to always sign up to share the information with fellow employers. It's good information to have. As far as what we do here at Monterey County Works, our mission is to bring local job seekers and employers together through our employment and training programs. On the employer end, we offer customized job fairs and recruitments for you to participate in on a weekly basis. It's either a multiple employer job fair or a customized recruitment. We have job boards and other promotional activities. We can post your jobs on our job board on our website as well as on CalJobs itself. We offer incumbent worker training and on-the-job training. Those are both incentivized training programs for you to onboard our personnel that are enrolled in our employment and training programs. I encourage you to check out our website to learn more about that, MontereyCountyWorks.com, MontereyCountyWorks.com. We've got a video on there for both of those things for you to learn more. Some of our other resources are our 1-800 number that is hosted through CEA, and that is something that is definitely something you should take advantage of, 1-888-217-6899, 1-888-217-6899, and that is all things HR related. You can call that number if you've got any questions. That's something that we pay for here, and it's free to use. Take advantage of that. It is hugely beneficial. You'd be amazed the kind of questions that folks come up with and need to know, and this is a resource for local businesses. Some of our other things include our hiring videos that we offer, our workforce minutes. There's all kinds of ways for employers to get involved with Monterey County Works. Again, log on to our website to learn more, MontereyCountyWorks.com. You can learn about all of our upcoming job fairs and recruitments and register for the events and then show up. It's very collegial. We have a fun time. Our employers get to meet each other, which is useful for their referral purposes. And we're all about serving our local community. So we're happy to be of service. And again, thank you to CEA for co-hosting this with us. We're looking forward to a great event today.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura, again, for your valued partnership and for everything that you do for employers in your county. So now I would love to introduce our trainer today. We have Juliana Gabriel, our Senior HR Compliance Director. So you are in great hands. And Juliana, it is all yours.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Laura and Monterey County Works for sponsoring this event today. We're very excited to train with you this morning. For those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time, I'd like to introduce California Employers Association, or CEA. We are an HR consulting company. We have members located throughout the state of California and even beyond California. And our goal is to provide you peace of mind with exceptional HR compliance solutions, training, coaching. So if you find you do need some additional support beyond that HR hotline provided to you by Monterey, you can join us as a CEA member. That will give you access to our extensive library of resources. So we have hundreds of HR forms and fact sheets and sample policies that you can use as you are running your business or in your day-to-day HR practice. We can also help you get compliant. So if you need a customized employee handbook, we can put that together for you. We can come on site and do an HR audit or give some training to your staff, like harassment prevention. And then we can help you with some of those trickier issues, consultations on things like workplace investigation issues, employee relation issues. So really comprehensive HR services. If you're interested in learning more about us, you can visit our website at employers.org, or you're welcome to call into us directly with any questions that you might have. This is just to give you a little idea of the different types of members and industries and workforce development boards that we serve. So we really do serve all types of members, from office and administrative environments to manufacturing, healthcare, construction, you name it. So we have a lot of great resources for you and subject matter experts with just a ton of different experience. Now, I do want to remind you that this presentation today is for educational purposes only and should not be relied upon as legal advice. So CEA is not a law firm. We're not giving you legal advice today on this training or when you're calling into that hotline. So if you do have an issue of legal significance, make sure you consult your own attorney about that. But as Anna mentioned, you're more than welcome to ask us questions or clarification about the training today. You can go ahead and put that in the chat box, and we will try to monitor that throughout. All right, so let's talk about what is on our agenda. Today, we're focused all about remote and our hybrid workers. And you might be wondering, is remote work a good fit for your organization? Or maybe you have an employee that's requesting to work remotely, or maybe you're trying to call people back to the office and you're wondering, what kind of balance should we strike? So we're going to go over all of the pros and cons and questions that you should consider. We're also going to spend some time on compliance. So for our remote workers, how do we satisfy our wage and hour requirements? Do we need to accommodate them if you have someone that's making a request to work remotely, but you want to be on site with that team? And how do we handle things like business expense reimbursements? And then we're going to close out talking about how we support and retain our remote employees. And in addition to just all of the experience I have working with CEA members and employers, I am a remote employee, so I have a lot of insight to bring on this. Sometimes we feel like we're out on our own little island. It can be harder for those remote workers to stay engaged and connected to the workplace. So we have some tips for you on that as well. So let's kick it off with this question. Is remote work a good fit for your organization? And I first want to start with a discussion on just kind of where we're at right now with the current climate across the US. What has kind of remote work looked like in the past few years? So obviously during the pandemic, out of necessity, there was a boom of remote work as businesses tried to figure out, how are we going to keep our doors open, keep our people employed? And so a lot of people experimented with it for the first time, and there was really great feedback. A lot of employees loved it. A lot of people said, this is the first time I feel like I've really achieved true work-life balance. And there was arguments that, hey, we're actually being more efficient, saving more costs. So there was this boom of remote and hybrid work. Then I would say within the past year or so, maybe a couple years, we see a growing number of organizations that are kind of now rolling that back. And there's different arguments for why that's happening. A lot of it has been started with, I would say, bigger companies, tech companies, kind of making people return to the office. And there's arguments maybe it was due to having all of these office and contracts for real estate. Whatever the reason is, we are seeing that where companies are kind of starting to scale back and have return to work or return to office type programs. We've also seen that even just on the state level with the state of California and government employees, with arguments being we want people in person and collaborating. And right now, I would say also employers have a little bit more leverage in the labor market. It's kind of a slow hire, slow fire environment. And so employees aren't able to make as many demands on that as they maybe were a few years ago when it was a very hot labor market. But we are still hearing that many employees, when they are looking for a job, they still prefer remote or hybrid work options. It's very important to them. And so if talent and retaining talent is an area that you're kind of concerned about right now, you might be more inclined to still kind of consider those remote and hybrid work options. There was, just to give an idea of how important this is to some people, there was a question recently that went viral on social media. There was a debate. Would you rather take $120,000 a year remote or $240,000 a year, but you're completely on site in office? And it was a heated debate. Many people were saying they would prefer the remote, even if it means that they're earning less. So it carries its own monetary value in a lot of people's eyes. It's as another benefit or another form of compensation is another way that you can look at it, because there is cost savings. They're not having to commute and they can take care of personal matters. And employees in general are still kind of looking for more autonomy about when, where, and how they are performing the work. So with that said, I would love to hear from our audience today on which best describes your workplace right now. This will kind of help our discussion. So are most of you fully on site? Are you in more of a hybrid work model? Maybe you have an exclusively remote team or teams and then your exclusive on-site team, or are you kind of one of the rare ones where you have 100% remote workers? So let me know. I see the answers coming in here. I'm going to go ahead and share those results for all of you. We're actually a little bit all over. It looks like we have about half of you that are still fully on site. So my guess is you're here to kind of consider whether you want to allow remote work maybe for certain positions or a team. So we're definitely going to go over some things to consider for you. And then we have others that have a hybrid work model, about 38%, and then some of you with exclusively remote and exclusively on site. And then no one on here today with a 100% remote workforce, which doesn't surprise me. Usually it is a little bit of a combination. Let's start with some questions to answer when it comes to remote and hybrid work options. So first, you're going to want to ask, is this really right for our company? And really only you can answer that, right? If you are, let's say a retail boutique, it might not make sense to have any remote workers. You need a lot of client interaction. People are coming into your workplace. Whereas if you're in more of an office or maybe white collar setting, it could make sense. Sometimes, and I would say most of the time, it really makes sense for maybe certain roles only, right? That can be performed productively, roles that are really done every day on a laptop versus people who need to be physically present and maybe interacting with your clients and customers. Something else to consider is, is it something that your roles could be done remotely? And are you having trouble either attracting talent right now or retention issues, holding on to people if maybe you did return back fully on site and you found that you lost folks? So is it something you should consider from a talent or retention perspective? Have you had problems or issues with it in the past? So maybe you did it, temporarily during the pandemic and there were some communication issues or team dynamics that you didn't really love. And remember, during that time, we were all forced to kind of jump into it where we could. So now, are there ways that you could maybe be a little more thoughtful about it and have some policies or processes in place that would actually make it successful for certain roles? And then when are you legally required to consider it? We'll answer that question in a little bit. All right, so what are some of the pros of remote work? And I'd love if you'd go to the chat box and share any others that we don't have on here. But for a lot of employers, a wider talent pool, as we already talked about. Those candidates out there are still looking for remote and hybrid work. And we're hearing that remote job postings are just getting flooded with applicants. So you're going to have almost the opposite problem, probably almost too many resumes to go through in certain instances. But also employee satisfaction, especially if you have employees that maybe were working remotely during the pandemic. They got used to some of the perks of that, right? And so that might be a good retention tool. As I mentioned, they see it as a benefit. There was actually a recent study last year where 47% of remote employees said that they would quit their job if they were ordered to return to the office full time. So that's how high stakes it is for certain people. Cost savings are often related to the physical space. So obviously, things like rent, maybe you can have a smaller office space if you're hybrid and people are trading off coming into the office. You don't need to have as many desks. And also just in general, utilities, maintenance, cleaning costs can kind of go down if you have a remote workforce. Efficiency. I can tell you at one time when I was hybrid, I planned a lot of my productive work for my remote days because I knew when I was in the office, there's going to be more disruption and kind of chitter chatter and collaboration maybe on other issues, which is not a bad thing, right? It's good for our teams to collaborate and to bond. But a lot of remote workers will tell you they feel more efficient when they are at home and kind of left alone to get their work done. And then there's also arguments that it's more sustainable for the environment as we have less people on the road commuting. All right, now, of course, there are cons with remote work as well. It's not all, rosy and perfect. So a lot of managers will tell you that there's less oversight for their teams, right? They might not know what their employees are doing at a given time when they're remote, especially if they have a hard time reaching them. So there might be concerns about, well, how productive are they actually? And how do we really measure that if we can't see them? Logistical issues. Sometimes it's just easier to sit down in person, right? And look at a document together or collaborate on a project. We can't always replace that in a virtual setting. We can get close, but it's usually not going to be quite the same as in person. Less opportunities, spontaneous opportunities for collaboration and engagement, right? Just as a remote worker, I love that I can be efficient and plug away at my work, but it's going to be less natural for it to come up that, I might say, hey, to a coworker, like, I had a new idea. Let's talk about this. That's going to probably come up less in a remote environment. And then also more opportunities for miscommunication, right? With remote workers, it's going to be more likely that we're communicating via email or team chats, and you don't have the benefits of hearing their tone of voice, their body language. You might not have as much context, right? And so it can lead to sometimes misunderstandings and miscommunication. And I saw a question that came in here to the chat. Do we have to reimburse expenses for remote workers? We are going to answer that just in a little bit in our compliance section. I know that's a really important question that comes up for a lot of employers. All right, so some other considerations if you have an employee, let's say that it maybe is requesting to work remote, or you're considering it for a team or a department, what are some of the factors that you really want to drill down on? So first, the position's requirements, right? When you are thinking about, especially for an individual, whether you want to allow them to work remotely or maybe on a hybrid schedule, we want to be thinking about what are the essential functions, the core functions of their job, and can they perform those remotely? Even if they can, do they have some of non-daily tasks, but tasks that do come up, for example, for like an administrative assistant, where they have done the bank runs for us and they filter through the mail and those kind of things that we have to be thoughtful. Do we want to shift that to someone else? Can we maybe allow them to do a hybrid but not full remote? So we should be thinking about each individual position. Employee performance might be another consideration. So if you've been allowing someone to work remotely, or maybe you did during the pandemic, were they equally productive and as accessible? And that accessibility is a big one, right? If you have someone that maybe on their in-office days, they're very easy to reach, they're very responsive, but suddenly on their remote days, we're not hearing from them for hours. That can be a potential red flag, right? And something that we probably need to address with them head on if we're going to continue to allow that arrangement. And then also the overall performance of the team and the department. So is that still working seamlessly? Even if you have a person that's responsible, right? Are there things getting missed because they're not at the work site to collaborate? Travel costs is another big one. So I'm kind of getting ahead here with compliance issues. But if a remote worker's primary location of work is designated as their remote home office, if you then call them into your work site, your office, that's no longer a regular commute. That's now business related travel, right? Because the majority of their time they're working from home. That's their location. And so we have to pay them for our non-exempt hourly employees. That's on the clock time that we have to pay them for. And whether they're exempt or non-exempt, we also have to reimburse them for their business costs if they're traveling in their personal vehicle. So for example, reimburse them with the IRS mileage rate. So that's something to be thinking about. If they're hybrid, it gets a little trickier to define, well, what is that primary work location? I think you have an argument if they're at your office the majority of the time, let's say 3 days a week, that you can designate that as their primary work location. But I would recommend putting that in the remote work agreement that you have with them, being very clear that your office is their primary work location. I think it gets harder to make that argument if they're mostly remote, let's say 4 days a week remote, and they're only coming in once a week to your office. You might not be able to make that argument. Applicable laws is another big one. And this got missed a lot during the pandemic when we all kind of shuffled people home. Typically, the state or local law where the employee is physically performing the work is the one that's going to apply. So even if you're in Monterey, for example, if you have someone working remotely out of their home in Oakland, the minimum wage there is $17.34 an hour. So that's what you would have to pay them. Oakland also has its own local sick leave ordinance. And you can imagine if you have someone that's working out of state, it gets even more complicated, right? If they're, let's say, performing work for you in Nevada, it's going to be Nevada employment laws that are generally going to apply. And it gets even trickier if they're going back and forth into California and out of California. You're probably going to want to consult with legal counsel about that and a tax advisor on how you handle that, how you might want to break that up. And then finally, fairness and employee engagement, right? We want to be consistent. I would recommend if you get a request and it's kind of a new request for remote work, it's not something your company has really done before, I would develop a policy with very specific guidelines on how someone makes a request, which positions are eligible, which are not, And that way you can really be fair and transparent and just clear on the expectations through the process. If you kind of cherry pick people to work remote or not, if they make a request, people are going to be aware of that, as we talked about. People see this as a benefit and as a monetary benefit. It's almost on that level, right? So we want to make sure that we don't have any claims of favoritism or discrimination when it comes to approving remote work. Now, if you are considering someone relocating out of state, and when I've seen this come up is when an employer might have someone that's maybe been an employee with them for a while, and they don't want to lose that talent. And that person says, hey, my spouse got a new job out of state. I'm going to be relocating. And they say, hey, well, let's see if we can make this work. There is going to be a lot of homework when it comes to approving an out of state relocation. Don't jump and say, yes, we can do it. You're going to want to do your research on this. So there's typically a few different steps that you'll want to take. So first is you're going to need to register as an employer in that state for payroll purposes and to get an EIN number. And a good place to start is often the state's Department of Revenue. But a lot of the times employers will work with, again, a legal counsel or tax advisor, or sometimes your payroll company can really help you out with this as well, especially if they're national. We also have to look into things like state and local income taxes, if they're applicable in that state. Some states don't have their own income tax. The state's employment laws, right? We're going to want to make sure we have a strong understanding. Now, for a lot of states, they're typically less stringent than what's required in California, but even states you'd be surprised do have, pretty extensive employment laws where you might not think they do. Oftentimes, the employer will have to pay into state unemployment insurance or paid family leave programs, very similar to what we have here in California with the EDD. You're also going to want to check with your workers' comp carrier if they will cover the employee in that state. Some states do also require you to buy state-sponsored workers' comp insurance, so that's a good question to ask as well. Healthcare coverage, will your healthcare plan cover that employee in that other state if you do provide healthcare coverage? And then also, for certain states, there are professional licensing requirements for that employee to be able to perform that job. So for example, with lawyers, if they're barred in the state of California, they're not necessarily barred in the other state where they want to practice law. So they would have to get that license, right, to be able to do that. All right, some other recommendations if this is something you are considering, and especially when you are going from either fully in office to hybrid or hybrid to remote, consider a trial period. Before you approve it, let them know that you want to try it out and that it's completely in the company's discretion after that trial period to decide what to do. And maybe do it for 3 weeks to a month and provide metrics to really objectively measure. Are they meeting their work goals? Are they just as responsive as they are in the office? So you can test it out in that way, communicate to employees the decision isn't final. And a lot of the times, things will come up that you didn't even consider, right? Oh, we're not able to do that anymore because this person isn't in the office, or they handled this task that we didn't think about. And sometimes there's workarounds to that, but it's better to know before you make something permanent. All right, another recommendation that we have for you would be to come up with a written remote work policy, as I talked about, before you even entertain any sort of requests for remote work. And there's a few things that I would recommend including in this remote work policy. So first, which positions are eligible, right? Probably not all positions are eligible for remote work, or maybe some are eligible for hybrid, but not fully remote, right? We want to be very specific about that, as well as your pre-approval process. So how do they make a request? Does it need to be in writing? Does it go to their supervisor? Does it go to human resources? Who has the final say on that? Is it the CEO? Is it the department head? Other things I would cover in there are your expectations on what that arrangement needs to look like. So I would always say you need to be in a quiet and distraction-free space, right? I have heard of a lot of issues from employers over the years with their remote workers where they're sometimes in shared spaces. Maybe they're working at their kitchen table and their spouse is also working remotely, and then their kids come home or their pets, and there's interruptions and distractions, right? So we want to be really clear about that. Also having sufficient internet. And that's usually not a problem for most employees in this day and age, but if they live in a really rural or remote location, it could be. Things like security, privacy and confidentiality of your systems, of your client information. Think about how you want to handle that. For a lot of employers, they set up what's known as a VPN or a virtual private network, because when someone's on their own Wi-Fi, it might not be as secure as your systems at the office, and it could be more susceptible to hacking. And you might also have protocol for what they're able to access and how when they are working remotely. Another thing that I would recommend putting right there in the policy, if you don't want people to be engaged in caregiving during working hours, is that there is no caregiving while they are working for you. And if you can define the work hours, very clearly, I think that also is helpful. But I've seen a lot of remote workers that just kind of assume that they can engage in, childcare or care of dependent adult, pets, maybe school, pickups and drop-offs. And so we want to be really clear if that's not what we want, right? Just like we would with any office employee. And then make sure you also include the company's discretion to revoke the remote work arrangement at any time. Remind the employee that they're at will, right? Meaning that you can change the terms of and conditions of employment within your discretion. If you find that it's not working well for the company, it wouldn't be advisable to make some sort of contract or legal, agreement, promise without consulting legal counsel about that. All right, and then on an individual level, I would recommend also preparing a remote work agreement or outline of remote work for that individual. It doesn't need to be anything super formal, but I would address a few things. Number one is the location or address where that remote work will be performed. I had some employers before that have been surprised to find out that the employee was not working from home. They actually went out of country or out of state for a period of time because they thought, well, I'm remote, I can work from anywhere, right? But now we have different laws that potentially apply when an employee does that. So we really want to be clear on what is the location that is approved for remote work. Go over their work schedule availability requirements. So for example, with CEA, we say you need to be available Monday through Friday from 8 to 5 for our internal staff and for our members, right? Be very specific on what that needs to look like. A list of assigned company equipment. So whatever you furnish them, whether it's a laptop or a headset and printer, right? We want to make sure we're keeping track of that, especially if we have a lot of remote employees and that they understand that that is still company property. So you want to make sure someone in your operations team or management team has a running list of that and identifiers for each item. You also are going to want to cover how you are handling reimbursement for remote expenses. I promise you we're going to talk about that in just a minute. I know that that's kind of a big question. If they're hybrid, you should be clear on what are their remote versus in-office days. So for some employers, it's set weekdays, right? You need to be in the office Monday, Wednesday, Friday, no exception. For others, they might say, well, we just want you in, 3 days a week, but we don't care which 3 days of the week that you choose. So make sure that that's outlined. And then I would also recommend attaching a current job description that's up to date. So it's really clear, right? What are those core functions that you expect that they are still performing and meeting those expectations, just like they would be required to do in the office. And if you are a CEA member, under our HR forms, we do have a sample written remote work policy and agreement available to customize. All right, so now that we've kind of discussed some of the different pros and cons and questions you should ask as you are making assessments of whether to allow remote or hybrid work, let's talk now about some of the compliance when it comes to accommodations and also wage and hour. So I want to start with this question. If you can give me your best guess in the chat, I would really appreciate it. Are we ever legally obligated to allow an employee to work remotely? Maybe we're a 100% on-site organization. Are we legally obligated to ever allow an employee to work remotely? Let me know what you think in the chat. All right, so I have a brave attendee guessing no, no, a lot of no's. Anyone think yes, that we might, under certain circumstances, be required to allow it? All right. Well, the answer is actually, and it is to the surprise of many employers, sometimes. Even if you are a 100%, you have an on-site policy, it can be required. And when it is going to potentially come up is if someone has a medical condition or disability and they're indicating that they may need a reasonable accommodation. under the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's the federal law that applies if you have 15 or more employees, or California's Fair Employment and Housing Act, which applies if you just have 5 or more employees. So if you're smaller than that, then these laws don't apply to you. But if you have at least 5 or more employees, then you're going to want to pay attention to this. So let's say that you have an employee that comes to you and they indicate, either I need to work remotely because I have this medical condition or disability, or maybe you're calling them back to the office and they say, they provide a doctor's note and they say, I can't work remotely due to this medical condition. What is your obligation? Your obligation is to engage in the interactive process with the employee to determine if you can reasonably accommodate them, including potentially with the remote work, unless it would cause an undue hardship to you. But a couple things with that. You do not just have to take the employee's word on it. They do need to provide medical substantiation from their doctor indicating that they have that need. So we don't need to know what their medical reason is, if they have cancer or PTSD, right? We don't need to know that, but the doctor does need to advise us what potential limitations this person has. And then we can engage in the interactive process. Now, for some jobs, essential duties can only be performed on site. So for example, if you have a waiter at a restaurant or a construction worker, they're not going to be able to perform the essential functions of their job by working remotely, right? So in that case, you would probably not have to approve remote work as a reasonable accommodation. You could look at, is there another job that they're potentially qualified for that could be done remotely? Or maybe we need to provide them a leave of absence, right? Let's say you had someone that fell and broke their arm and they need surgery and some time to recover. Maybe we provide them a leave of absence in that case. But for other positions, the essential functions arguably can be performed remotely, right? And so once they have provided that medical substantiation that they have a need, it's important to know that you cannot just deny the remote work request based on employer preference or because you've established that it's a 100% on-site environment. The EEOC is very clear on that. We also cannot deny the accommodation just because the job involves some contact with other employees. So the way that the federal enforcement and California enforcement agency view this is there's workarounds to that, right? You can jump on Zoom, you can jump on the phone. And so just because there's some contact that's required is not a reason you can outright deny that request. But the good news is you can consider other effective accommodation options depending on what the person is saying their need is. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say that you have an employee and they say, I'm very sensitive to light in the office and I've been getting horrible migraine headaches. It's interfering with my work. So I am requesting to work remotely. And you get information from the doctor and you find out that this employee can be exposed to certain type of light, maybe in short periods of times, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And you figure out actually, hey, we have a private office that we could provide you with appropriate lighting, which would not cause this issue. And you provide that as an option to the employee and the employee tries it out and it works and it satisfies the issue. They don't have to work remotely because you found another effective accommodation. So you do sometimes have other options available. So let's talk about when we might need to provide telework or remote work as a reasonable accommodation. If someone has difficulty commuting to and from work due to a disability, let's say they broke their leg and they can't drive right now, something like that. And if their job can be performed remotely without undue hardship, right? Exposure to chemicals, irritants, temperature sensitivity, problematic lighting was the example that I gave, viruses or bacteria. We had this come up a lot during COVID where people would provide a doctor's note that they're immunocompromised and so that it wasn't safe for them to come into an office environment, for example. That one's a hard one to get around, obviously, because you're going to be exposed if you come to the office most of the time. But there could sometimes be other recommendations from the doctor where you could get around that. Lack of privacy to manage personal medical needs. Let's say if someone, goes to the bathroom, it's not, they're not able to control that, right? And so they don't want to be in the work site environment, taking certain medication or receiving treatment at specific times, distractions affecting concentration. But at the end of the day, remember, the work expectations must still be met. So they have to be able to still perform the essential functions of their job in a remote capacity. And if you do have more questions about this, or reasonable accommodations in general. It can be kind of a tricky area. The Job Accommodation Network is a federal agency that helps give employers guidance. They have a ton of resources. I would highly recommend taking a look. You can go to askjan.org or call us on the hotline, and we'll happy to help you out if you have some of these types of requests being made. All right, so what are the wage and hour rules for our remote workers? They are the same as any other worker, whether they're on site or working remotely, especially for our non-exempt hourly employees. We want to make sure that we are following the exact same rules. And in fact, I think that employers tend to be more lax with their remote workers, thinking, the remote worker can kind of manage their own time, take a break when they want to. But we actually probably want to have even stronger systems and tracking, because it's so easy for remote workers to kind of, fall out of following those processes, such as timekeeping, right? They need to understand that they absolutely still need to be tracking their time. And if you have like a traditional time clock in your on-site location, you're going to want to be thinking about, well, how are we going to make sure that they can track time? Is it going to be an app on their phone or on their computer? So be thoughtful about that. Meal and rest breaks. I would specifically put on their schedule when they need to take their meal and rest breaks, or have their supervisor, if they're communicating constantly on things like Teams, have their supervisor reach out to them just like they would in the office and say, it's time to take your break. So that's being tracked. They should be clocking in and out for that meal break. And for the rest break, if we can document somewhere or have somewhere them acknowledge that they received the rest break, that they took it, that would also be ideal. Overtime is sometimes another issue with remote workers. They might be plugging away and they get in a really good groove, and then all of a sudden they've accidentally worked overtime, right? So be really clear on that. How do they get authorization? Do they need authorization? Is it in their discretion? Do they need to reach out to their supervisor and get written approval? And it's important to know that even if you have someone, whether they're on site or remote, if they work overtime, even if it wasn't authorized, you, the employer, still have to pay for it. So you can coach them, you can discipline them on that, but you still always have to pay for it. So I would recommend with your remote workers that you have them sign acknowledgement of your wage and hour policies on these areas, including that off the clock work is restricted, right? All of your time needs to be accounted for when you are working for us. All right, so what about this situation? Voluntary remote work. We're getting into reimbursement now. We do not require remote work, but it is an option for our employees. Are we still obligated to reimburse at-home remote work expenses? And the answer is we do not have a clear answer yet from the California courts on this, on if remote work is truly voluntary, meaning they're not encouraged to work remotely, they're not mandated to work remotely. You tell your employees, hey, we have the office space for you here, we have all of the equipment you need, but if you want, you could choose to work from home, right? So there's some legal practitioners that say if you do that, if you give everything that they need at the office and they can come in at any time, that maybe you don't have to reimburse those at home, remote expenses. I think the problem is we don't have clear guidance on this, and there's case law developing that already in certain situations, it's clear that we do need to provide our remote workers a reimbursement. So the more cautious approach would still be to reimburse them something or to consult your legal counsel. Now, if you have remote workers that you are encouraging to work remote, or you have a remote work policy, then what expense reimbursements are remote workers entitled to receive? And just like our on-site employees, Labor Code Section 2802 applies, which says that we must reimburse all employees for necessary and reasonable work-related costs incurred in performing their job duties. So basically, the cost of doing business falls on you, the employer, not the employee. So some common examples that come up is necessary equipment. If they need a laptop, printer, a headset to be able to effectively do their job, you either need to furnish them those items or you need to reimburse them a reasonable amount for those items. Personal cell phone is another one. This comes up for both remote and on-site employees, but we do have a case on this. It's the Cochran case back from 2014 that says the employer, if an employee is using their personal cell phone for business purposes, the employer needs to be reimbursing them something for that, or you need to furnish them a company-provided cell phone. So I'll talk about that one more in a minute. how you figure out what to reimburse for the cell phone. Internet service for business purposes. This is a big one, and it applied to remote workers. So this is the leading case right now on remote work expenses, TIE versus IBM, 2023 case. And what happened there is that IBM, due to a mandatory stay-at-home order, sent its employees to work from home, and they did not reimburse them for internet access, phone service, headsets, and computer costs. And what IBM tried to argue is, well, we were forced to require people to work remote due to that stay-at-home order, and so we shouldn't have to cover these costs. And the court said, no, 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 you're the employer. The cost of doing business falls on you, not on your employees. So you do need to be reimbursing them for those things. I've also seen some other court cases out there that are unpublished that have said, potentially even utilities, electricity and water. So we don't have a good published opinion that's gone that far yet. Still a gray area, but we do know at a minimum, we should probably be reimbursing our remote employees for internet, phone, and equipment. And then just like anyone else, work-related travel and dining expenses when they are traveling for work away from their home site. All right, so how might we figure out that cell phone and also maybe the internet reimbursement? So what the Cochran case said is that we need to reimburse employees for using their personal cell phone for work-related calls or business. Even if they're just using it to clock in and out each day, you should be reimbursing them something for that. Or we need to provide them a company-provided cell phone. And the court clarified here, even if they have an unlimited data plan, even if they're already paying this cost, either way, you still have to reimburse them a reasonable percentage that represents their business use. And they kind of left us with that. There wasn't much guidance after that. So what are the best practices in this area? We would recommend that you ask employees to provide you a copy of their cell phone plan so you can get a sense of, okay, what is their monthly charge? So let's say that their monthly bill is $100. Now we're going to determine what percentage of that do we think is work-related use. So if they're in sales and they are on that thing all the time making calls, maybe we decide, 70% is probably business, 30% personal. Or if they're just making a few calls here and there, maybe we decide it's 20%. So if it's 20%, then we're going to pay them $20 a month, right? 20% of that cell phone bill. So what you're going to want to do is come up with a reasonable monthly stipend. There's some employers, they'll collect everybody's cell phone bills and kind of figure out, if it's a similar job duties or for a team, they can figure out, okay, what are we going to set the same reimbursement for everyone? You can do it that way as long as you're sufficiently reimbursing business costs. And then you're going to want to notify employees to contact you if they don't believe they're sufficiently being reimbursed. All of a sudden that cell phone bill hikes up for whatever reason, that they should contact you. And you can put that as part of the remote work agreement. I imagine the internet for remote workers would be handled in a similar fashion. I think the court would probably use the same line of reasoning there. All right, someone said, what is considered reasonable? So in making those assessments, like for example, for a laptop, if they just need a basic laptop to do their work, you can look at what's kind of the fair market value to get just a regular laptop. If they go out and buy the top of the line laptop with all of the bells and whistles and they don't need all of the bells and whistles to do their job, let's say they buy a laptop that's, over $1,000, you could say, hey, we looked at, for the cost of a laptop that you need would be about $300, right? So that's what we're going to reimburse you. So that's kind of how you can try to gauge what's reasonable. It's going to be based on that person's job duties. All right, final pay is sometimes a tricky issue when it comes to our remote workers. So just to kind of remind you about our final pay rules, the final pay is supposed to be a live check. So even if they've agreed to direct deposit, our labor commissioner says that direct deposit agreement does not stand for the purpose of the final check. It is supposed to be a live check. And for terminations, anytime we're ending the relationship, it needs to be due at the time and place of termination. And we always say, when the words are leaving your mouth, you should be handing that check over to the employee. For voluntary resignations, if they give you more than 72 hours notice, let's say a week or 2 weeks notice, then pay is always due on their last day of their employment. If they give you 72 hours notice or less, let's say they just quit on the spot, you have 72 clock hours after notice is given to get them that final check. And that's not business days, it's clock hours. So it happens very quickly. Now, why is this potentially more complicated for our remote workers? Because they're not probably most of the time physically with us when we might need to terminate them. So what are some of our options? Option number one, this would be in an ideal world. If the employee lives close to your office or they are hybrid, ask the employee to come to the work site and handle it like you would with any other on-site employee, right? You can let them know, you can hand them their final check and their paperwork right then and there. If you can't do that, another option could be to send another employee to meet with the remote worker. It doesn't have to be at their home. They could meet kind of at a neutral location. And then again, they're able to physically give them that final paycheck and the paperwork. Now, a lot of the times, for whatever reason, neither of these are super ideal for the employer. And so a final option that doesn't have the blessing from our California Labor Commissioner or a California court, but it's something that I do see a lot of employers do, is they overnight the final check and paperwork to ensure it arrives at that remote worker's home. And then they can say, okay, did you receive the packet, right? Maybe they're on Zoom or they're on a phone call now, and the employee confirms, yes, I have the packet in hand. Okay, open that packet. And in that packet, they now have that final check in hand, right? And their paperwork at the time and place of termination. So that could be potentially an option. We don't have a lot of clear guidance on it. You can imagine that there can also be some hiccups with that, but that's a way that some companies have handled it. Plus, if they have your company equipment, you can send them a prepaid box to return that equipment back to your location that's already paid for. They just have to drop it off in the mail. All right, so I want to spend the last portion of this training talking about supporting and retaining our remote workers. So how do we stay connected? How do we keep them engaged when we are in these remote and hybrid work environments? And I want to ask you all, if you do have remote workers, what has been your biggest challenge when it comes to remote work and hybrid teams? Is it miscommunication issues, or it could be your biggest fear if you don't have remote workers? So is it miscommunication issues, lack of connection, performance management, engagement, and retention? All right, thank you for your responses. Going to go ahead and share these results. We're kind of a little bit all over the board, actually. So it's a little bit of everything, right? That miscommunication that's coming up because we're communicating probably digitally a lot of the times. That lack of connection and probably, spontaneous engagement. Performance management and discipline, that's another one. And just overall keeping those people happy and retaining them. So we're going to talk about some tips here that can help you out in these areas. So first, if you are onboarding people that are going to be remote, it is even more important for those folks that you help them feel like they're a part of your team, like they understand your company's culture, your kind of nuances, your politics, the hierarchy, right? There's all of these things that we kind of absorb when we're in an on-site environment that remote workers are going to have a harder time, right, catching up on. So with that, some things that you might want to consider when you're onboarding remote workers. Consider a temporary on-site or hybrid onboarding period. So that is something that we do at CEA a lot of the times for our newer employees that are going to be remote. For a month or a couple months, they do, if they're local, have to come on site a couple days a week to really bond, get to know the team, see the dynamics. But if you can't do that, let's say you have someone that's going to be out of state, could you consider bringing them in for a week or maybe 2 weeks? Can you afford to put them up so that they can really get integrated during that period? If you can't do that, or maybe in addition to that, another thing we do at CEA is we require the new employee, to schedule virtual meetings with their colleagues to get to know them. So they have to reach out, schedule a Zoom with each person on their team. You can have them also do it with other department leaders or managers, right? And it's just a meet and greet. Just get to know, ask questions that they might have about that person's role or how they might work together. So that's a really great way to ensure that they are meeting everyone, because then they're going to be more likely to reach out, right? If they have a question or an idea, if they've already met them. We're going to want to schedule more frequent check-ins early on. And something we recommend, whether it's a remote or an on-site person, we think it's so valuable is the 30, 60, 90-day plan for that new hire, right? So give them goals for the first 30 days. We want you to learn this system. We want you to make contact with one customer. We want you to do your meet and greets with everyone on your team, right? And then the supervisor is checking in and giving performance reviews at the 30, 60, and 90-day mark. This is a great way to get them engaged and to make sure to be answering questions along the way. They feel supported, like they're getting feedback, and you can also assess whether they are a good fit. Also, whether you have a new remote worker, or maybe you have a lot of remote workers, but you're trying to figure out new ways to kind of get them engaged, you can develop an engagement plan, and you're going to want to work really closely with their supervisor on this. It's really the supervisor's responsibility to kind of determine, okay, what should the frequency be on check-ins with that person? Are we going to make sure that we have a standing call or a Zoom every week? Are we going to make sure that I'm calling that person maybe once every couple of weeks and giving them feedback? How are we making sure that it's just integrated into our process? What are our metrics to monitor that person's performance? So how are we doing that? And if we set up goals and benchmarks and we put that in writing, it's going to be a lot more likely that we're going to follow up on those things and be able to manage their performance successfully. Of course, we're going to still schedule our performance reviews like we do with any other employee. But other things you could do, especially if you are concerned about performance, is you can look forward. So let's schedule weekly goals, right? Maybe you and the supervisor and the employee are working on that together. Or maybe you're asking the employee to come up, what do you plan to do? What are your priorities for this week? Or on the flip side, we might do work reports. What did you do last week? What did you accomplish? Because if we don't always have deliverables or specific deadlines, we might not know that they're actually doing a lot more than we think, right? Maybe they troubleshooted something with another colleague, or they assisted another team. It's good to know that, and we can get that summary from them. And also, we want to make sure we're having consistent opportunities for feedback. There's a lot of studies out there that suggest that employees want feedback about once every 7 days, whether it's positive or negative. They want to know where they stand. So we want to make sure our supervisors are staying on top of that. All right, last poll I have for you here. It's kind of a fun one. Do you think that it's effective to monitor employees' keystrokes? There's a lot of companies for remote workers now that will monitor, how often they're typing or engaged with the keyboard or their mouse. So let me know what you think. There's no right or wrong answer. So the options are yes, I want to know what my employees are working, that they're working. No, I don't want my employees to feel like they're spying, like we're spying on them, or not sure. All right, thank you for your participation. I'm going to share results. So it looks like 71% of us say no, I don't want my employees to feel like we're spying. And you might be in an environment where you have really strong trust with your employees. You haven't had a reason to question or doubt them, right? Then we have some that are saying, not sure, or yeah, I want to know whether my employees are working. And there's a lot of companies that do feel that way, especially when performance management has suffered. I would recommend if you are going to do something like this, make sure it's consistent, right? That you kind of have a uniform policy on who's going to be monitored. Or if you're doing it because the person's performance has suffered or they've been unreachable, make sure that's really well documented so we don't have claims of discrimination. And also, I would probably include some that where right in your employee handbook that you retain the right to do that if you do want to, just so that there's not an argument about violation of privacy. I would probably be really clear that you retain the right to, monitor those company systems, including keystrokes. All right, so we don't have to overcomplicate this when it comes to our remote teams. We can really stay connected in small ways and keep them engaged. So on a bigger scale, in terms of your management and your leadership team, be thinking about beyond just our team huddles, how often do we want to conduct virtual meetings with maybe other departments for that face-to-face interaction so that we can really collaborate? We're going to want to be intentional about that, right? Make sure that we are taking also the supervisor usually is the person to take time to discuss personal lives with that remote worker. Again, it's not going to come up as organically when we have someone in the office. And a lot of times we start to share that stuff a little more. And so to keep them feeling like a human, like a person, right? We want to make sure we set aside some of that time. You can do it at the start of the meeting or maybe at the end. Be like, hey, I wanted to check in with you. How did that, race go for you? So it can be, again, in small ways. We want to also make sure we're acknowledging the milestones. I would say this is even more important for our remote workers, that they feel like they're contributing, that they're valued. I would make sure we're giving those frequent reminders. And then consider on-site meetings or bonding opportunities for your employees. So that's another thing that we do at CEA that's been really effective. We meet on about a quarterly basis. Everyone comes on site, so we get to bond, but also talk about goals, report out on what we've been working on. So that's another really great way to stay connected. Maybe if you can't do it, quarterly, maybe you do it once a year, every other year, but that's another really great idea. All right, I want to give a big thanks again to Monterey County Works for sponsoring this. You all have been great. I really appreciate your engagement. And I want to remind you, you can reach out on that HR hotline if you do have any follow-up questions or HR related questions. We're available Monday through Friday from 8 to 5. But with that, I will turn it over to Anna so we can get you out of here on time.
All right. Thank you, Juliana. That was such a fascinating training. And I know like right now in this day and age, it's so important. So thank you for leading us through all of that content. If you need additional support, we do have some membership options for you to consider if you're not already a CEA member. And then I do want to draw your attention back over to the chat box if you have not been following along. So I did drop a couple of links moments ago for you. The next training coming up, sponsored by our partners over at Monterey County Works, is coming up on April 29th, Successful Succession Planning. This is a great one for, just thinking about the wealth of the company, and it's one that we don't do often, but we always get really great feedback. So we really encourage you to consider that one and mark your calendars and register at that link. And then, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, we continue to serve you by delivering these trainings by hearing directly from you. So if you can either scan that QR code that you see on the slide, I also dropped a link in the chat for your convenience. That will help us hear directly from you, and that's how you suggest future topics as well. And then if you are eligible for HRCI or SHRM certification, your links are on the screen and in the chat. HRCI code 733886, SHRM 26-96UCH. If you have any questions about what to do with those codes, please always reach out to us, ceainfo@employers.org, or you can always call your Monterey County hotline, and we're more than happy to guide you. And then speaking of, thank you again, Laura, to you and your entire team for your valued partnership and everything you do for employers in your area. And then thank you to Juliana again for leading us today. And then thank you all for taking time out of your busy week to spend training with us. And we hope to see you on that next training coming up on April 29th. Look for an email from me shortly with the PDF of the slide deck, just in case you weren't able to download it from Zoom. So you'll hear from me shortly. And thank you all. Have a good day.